So good morning, everyone. And we are just so thrilled to have you with us for this installment of Business Over Breakfast. My name is Pam Tipton, and I'm the Senior Director of Custom Programs for Emory Executive Education here at Goizueta Business School. And today I am joined by my colleagues Kavita Patel and Tammy Long. And we are so excited to welcome our speaker this morning. But before I introduce him, let me tell you a little bit about our topic for today. So in our interconnected world, communication is really often hailed as the cornerstone of understanding, collaboration, and progress. Yet there's often a paradox, literally a silent chasm that seems to widen even as we exchange words and gestures and glances. It's that illusion that communication has actually occurred. And often it remains incomplete, misunderstood, or in some cases, altogether absent. So, kind of imagine people conversing across a canyon or sometimes even across the street. They shout, their voices might echo off of the structures, but the words dissipate into the void. They nod, smile, maybe do a thumbs up, and assume there's been some kind of understanding. I realize that sometimes I did that very thing to my parents as they were shouting instructions as I drove out the driveway as a teenager. Yet, there's critical nuances that evade in that communication. There's unspoken fears and hidden motivations and unshared context. And so, therefore, that illusion that communication has happened persists. So it does permeate our personal lives as well as our work lives, and often global affairs, misunderstandings fester, and relationships can fracture, and opportunities might slip through our fingers. We send emails and attend meetings and engage in small talk, yet it persists. So the biggest problem in communication really isn't the lack of words. It's the assumption that that transmission, that communication, that connection has actually happened. And it really, really depends on our ability to actively listen with empathy and vulnerability, and requires bridging the gap with questions and clarifications and genuine curiosity. So let's dismantle this illusion today with our speaker, Clint Padgett, CEO and President of Project Success. Raised in a small town of Orangeburg, South Carolina, Clint grew up around small businesses. His father owned and operated several businesses, so he had a lot of exposure to those small businesses and kind of helped, if you will, from an early age. It instilled in him that entrepreneurial enthusiasm that really remains today, but importantly, the interpersonal connections that help a small business thrive. And it really helped him to see that this simple thing would help him go on to be central in his founding of Project Success. What's more, it taught him about people from all walks of life have great insights, and people play such a critical role in driving success. Clint really values teamwork and how projects can fall apart when teams aren't working as teams in unison. They weren't having conversations that were so critical to projects really getting across the finish line, because after all, it's conversation up close and personal. So when teammates freely make promises to each other, things really get done in a successful way. So we are looking forward to hearing from you, Clint. And as with all of our webinars, Clint invites you to ask questions along the way, offer some challenges you might be having, that he might have some solutions to, and we'll also reserve some time at the end. Kavita is going to be helping facilitate the Q&A, and we'll tell you a little bit more about our upcoming open enrollment programs here at Goizueta Business School and what to look forward next for Business Over Breakfast at the end of today's session. So Clint, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pam. Appreciate it. Very happy to be here today. I should just add to that it's really odd sometimes that I speak so passionately about people and teams and conversation, because I'm an electrical engineer by education, double E degree from Georgia Tech and an MBA from Duke. So, but I still love people. People are important. And I do a lot of project work. I've actually been lucky enough to work on I plan almost 30 worldwide sporting events for Coca-Cola, everything from Summer and Winter Olympics to the FIFA World Cups to the European Championships to Commonwealth Games. So I have a long history of doing Olympic work. And that's what Pam was alluding to. I was fortunate enough to have been asked to participate in the Olympic torch relay in Paris or in France at the end of May. So I actually ran the torch. I was one of thousands, so but still, it was really cool. I ran for 200 meters, and you pass the torch back and forth. You get the flame from one person, and you run 200 meters, and you hand it off to the next person. And so she was asking me, is the torch heavy? I'm like, I don't know. You don't feel it. You're just floating on air. It's such an amazing experience. So I was very fortunate to have had that experience. I am going to talk about conversation today, and I'm going to probably have more of a little bit of a project management bent on that because I do work on a lot of projects. And so I may throw some stories in from project work as well. But so I actually written two books, and the second one came out a couple of years ago on Forbes Books, and it was called How Teams Triumph. And in researching that book, I was confused. I think I didn't realize, I thought communication and conversation were the same thing. And I noticed from classes and sessions that I were in, it was always interesting to me that people like to be around people just like themselves. So if I'm teaching in class, let's say for 50 or 60 people at Caterpillar, for instance, and what will always happen is all the engineers will sit together on one side of the room because they speak the same technical language. They understand each other. They all took differential equations in college and wear that like a badge of honor. They think Dilbert is hilarious. They all get the same jokes. And then all the IT people kind of sit together, and then they don't mind sitting close to the engineers because they're still technically oriented. Then there'll be like a gap, a physical gap in the room of empty chairs, and then the marketing people so we'll sit. And it always struck me as so odd. And then I realized that it's because they don't speak the same language. As an engineer, I'm very tactical. I'm in the weeds. And as a marketing person or salesperson, maybe I'm strategic and I'm the big picture and I'm strategy. And those are very different conversations that need to be had. And so it's important that we have those conversations though, because if you're a for-profit company and marketing is out selling things that the engineering team can't build and deliver, we're not going to make money. And if engineering is building something for which there's no market, we're not going to make money. So the only way to really be profitable is to actually produce products and services that marketing and sales and marketing go out and sell. And the way we do that is by forcing people out of their silos, which is, as an engineer, I'll talk bad about us because I am one. We prefer to sit down, head down at our cubicle and design the perfect widget and don't want to come all your extra meetings and your project management meetings and your marketing meetings. I just want to do my job and design this perfect widget. And the issue is when I bring that back to the marketing people on the team, they go, there's no market for this. If you talk to me, we change this one thing, we could have sold 1 million. And so part of what we want to do in the conversation is to pull people like myself that are engineers out of the weeds up a little bit, maybe pull the strategic people down out of the clouds a little bit, and put us really on the same plane to have a conversation about what our project is or what our product needs to be. So I was doing the research and I was looking up the definition of communication because I thought that they were the same. I thought conversation equaled communication and vice versa. And according to Webster's dictionary, as you can see on the screen, the definition of communication is the act or process of using words, sounds, signs, or behaviors to express information. And so the key word there is really to express information. That means communication can take many forms, including conversation, but it can also take probably the forms that most people default to these days, which is to send a Slack message or send something on Jira or post something on Teams. And it's a one-way, it's one-way communication. And the problem we have with that is if you ever played the game telephone when you were a kid, there are other names for it in other countries, but telephone is the one that I'm familiar with. And if you haven't played the game, the way it works is one of us has a secret, we whisper it to somebody else who then whispers it to the next person, and the next person whispers it to the next person on down the line. And of course, what makes the game so much fun is it's amazing how much the message and how much the secret gets changed as it goes from the original person all the way to the last person who heard the secret. And it's different, wildly different. And so what makes the game fun when you are a kid makes the game not fun when you're in business, because unfortunately, the same thing happens in the business world. In the business world, as a leader or a manager, I may send a message that I think is crystal clear. But I post an email, I send a message on Teams, I put something on Jira or Slack, and I think, well, I've done a good job. My message is clear. I wrote it succinctly. I know it's going to be crystal clear to the team. And then I'm surprised when my message gets mangled along the way. And the reason that happens is when you communicate one way, and I get your message and I hear your message, I'm going to take that message. I'm going to filter it. I'm going to hear it through my own biases, the way that I define words. Maybe if I'm having a bad day that day, that will affect how I hear the message. I mean, how many times have you gotten a text message from somebody and just really got fired up and then realized later, all right, once you calm down, they didn't really mean it that way. Because the problem with one-way communications is there's no dialogue that happens. So what we want to do instead is have a conversation. With the conversation, you're actually able to ask clarifying questions, right? So now what would make the telephone game better is if each kid could have asked the original person, hey, what does this word mean? What do you mean by that? And in the business world today, we can say, when you say turn left, you mean turn left like right now, or turn left at the next stop sign or the next major intersection? What do you mean by turn left? Where are we turning left? So by asking these clarifying questions, the message gets received and then the way that in which you attended. And then you can then pass that message on to the next person who can ask clarifying questions. And your message doesn't get mangled along the way. And that's really one of the keys, is to have this conversation, this interaction, exchange of ideas. I was working in Chicago several years ago, and I was walking back to the hotel after having done a session. And I came across a group of individuals who were all in a big circle, and they were facing each other, but they were head down, busily tapping away on their phones. And I thought, I wonder if they're having I know I can see they're clearly communicating, but what I don't see is any kind of a conversation going on. And it actually motivated me to write this next cartoon, which is I'm going to share with you now. So I thought about communication and how we've kind of come full circle as a human race, if you will. Back in ancient times, if I wanted to go get dinner, I would basically draw an antelope or an elk on the wall with chalk and draw a spear and then point outside and grunt, which means let's go get dinner, right? And then of course we got spoken word. Spoken word came out, and now for eons we told story. We passed down our histories by telling stories around the campfire and passing that knowledge on to the next generation, who, when they got to be elders, they got to tell stories around the campfire and pass that same conversation on, right? Same stories on. Then we had written word. And we wrote these massive books, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged and, Gone with the Wind and the Bible, these huge, massive tomes. And I feel like we've kind of come full circle in the communication world, because now if I want to go to dinner, I just tap a few emojis on my phone and it's like saying, let's go get dinner. And so I'm happy with all forms of communication. I think they all have a place for sure. I'm not suggesting that everything we do be a conversation, but boy, conversation should not be thrown out. And I do think that as time has gone on, especially when we get these more technology, the Zoom calls, the team calls, all these things happen, there's a tendency to not have the conversation, just post it on Jira or Slack, send that email, and be done with it. And this was actually pre-pandemic as well. There was always this bias, I think, to not even walk down the hallway when we're all together face to face and stick my head in your office door and say, hey, can we talk a minute? And that's because as a human being, with my great to-do list of things I want to get done today, I have this burning desire to check things off the list. And so the easiest way that I know to check things off the list is to send you an email or a text message that it's done. And I really hope I never hear from you again. Because if I actually went down the hallway or picked up the phone and had a conversation with you, I might find out that not only am I not done, there were 3 other things that needed to get added to my list now. So of course I don't want that. What I really want is to be able to say, yep, I got that done, on to the next thing. So the easier way to do that is just to send that one-way communication, which is send that text message, put that post on Jira or Slack, send that email, and really hope nobody replies. How many times have you picked up the phone to answer a call and somebody says, oh, I was just going to leave a voicemail, which is interesting. Okay, you don't really want to talk to me. You just want to leave a voicemail and just move on. So one of my favorite quotes of all time is by George Bernard Shaw, and it says, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And that's one of the things that I see in project work in my world, is that people don't communicate well enough. And they think they're understood when they truly aren't understood, right? So what we want to do is have a conversation instead. And a conversation is really just an oral exchange. And the key word there is it's an exchange of ideas. So now it's a dialogue. It's not just a one-way street, it's a two-way street. So now we're going to have a conversation. You're going to ask clarifying questions. you'll be able to talk me off the ledge because I used a word I didn't like at first, but then as we have a conversation, I'm able to pick up on visual cues. I can understand what you're trying to say. Now I'm calmed down. I'm not taking your words in the wrong way. And I clearly know you want to turn left at the McDonald's and not at the major intersection down the street. So we have to have this dialogue, this back and forth, which is so critically important in business world. And certainly in my project work that I do, it's really, really important that we do that. And if you confuse, you lose. One of the challenges we often have is people say, oh, well, if I'm going to leave this a little bit ambiguous, a little bit open-ended, thinking that's going to give me room to maneuver later. But the problem is when you leave something open-ended, then it can be used against you. In my world, in the core of project management, but in general, just it'll be used against you as far as you left it open-ended. So I know one of the things that I find interesting is an easy one is we're going to finish the project in Q1. Okay, well, what does Q1 mean? So Q1 to the customer probably means January 2nd. I'll give you January 1st off, but January 2nd, I expect it. Q1 to the team probably means March 31st, right? Because that's the last day of the month or the last day of the quarter. So that's ambiguous. It's going to be used against me because I always intended as a team member to deliver March 31st, and the customer was always expecting January 2nd. So I'm always a big fan of black and white is your friend and gray is the enemy. So if it's going to be February 15th, say February 15th. If it's going to be March 31st, say March 31st. Don't hide behind Q1 because you're going to end up with bad expectations from the customer, and it's going to have a bad experience in the end. So one of the challenges we see with communication is, and again, from a project perspective, but this really applies in anything we do. Let's say that I have a project that I've been assigned to, and this is number 6. I've already got 5 on my plate at various stages of completion. Some are just starting, some are in the middle, and some are going to be hopefully ending soon. And I get assigned, I get called into a meeting. I'm going to be assigned to project number 6. And let's say that here at, say I work for Acme Corporation. Here at Acme Corporation, we don't really have any formal planning process. It's just people know their jobs. They get assigned to tasks. They just go do them. It's not a big deal. So here we have a kickoff meeting. And in the kickoff meeting, the business unit vice president or the senior executive stands up and says, here's the project. You've all been assigned to the team. You guys all know your jobs. Here's what we're going to do. It's got to be done by the end of the year. Call me if there's any questions. So when you walk out of that room, now been assigned to project number 6, how high is your worry level, right? And so you see on the screen, I've got one axis for worry and one axis for time. And we all have different ways of measuring worry. Some of us can measure worry by how upset my stomach gets when I worry about the project. I mean, is this going to be a 3 mailbox a day project or a 4 mailbox a day project? How little sleep do I get at night? Is this a 4-hour night sleep project or a 2-hour night sleep project? So that's really the idea is how much, how do you measure worry? We all have different ways of measuring worry. So what we found is the average person, the average team member, when they leave that meeting, having been assigned to project number 6, if the deadline is really way off in the future, let's say it's a year off in the future, then what ends up happening is they leave that room and they're not really very worried about the project. Why? Because they know 2 things. They know they're on the team and they got a year to do it. Instead, what I'm really worried about are the 5 other projects that I have on my to-do list right now that I've been getting beat up about for weeks and or months. All right, so that's one of the challenges we have is the level of worry just isn't very high. Right,
Clint,
yes.
we have a question in the chat room. The question is, how do you have good communication when conversation is not possible? For example, when creating process documents and knowledge documentation.
So I still think conversation can happen. What I would do is if you're collaborating that way, it's a good question. So if you're collaborating that way, if you're building something through an open document or whatever, then I still think you need to have some time where you're actually able to go in and just meet through Teams or through Zoom or whatever that might be. I work on some global projects, and of course that adds challenges because we're dealing with Asia, with India, with Europe, and the US. So there is no convenient time for all of us. It just never happens. So I'm on calls at 7 a.m. I'm on calls at 10 p.m. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. So I would just find time to carve out and say, can we just jump on a call? I've got a few questions I need to ask. What I'm trying to avoid is that you've all seen that email exchange that goes back 25 or 30 times, but could have been solved in a 5-minute phone conversation. So that I'm not suggesting that we only have conversations by any means. I do think that email has a place, Slack, Jira, Post have a place, Teams messages have a place. But I do think there are times when it's just better. You're more efficient if you just jump on a call for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, even if it's an inconvenient time. It will save you time overall and answer any questions that you have. So going back to the shift in the worry curve. So let's say that we walk out of the room. We're not super stressed about the project because I got a year to do it. We create life in about 10 months. I'm pretty sure I could do a project in 12 is what I'm thinking to myself. I'm pretty confident in my abilities. I got 5 other projects I've been getting beat up about for weeks and or months. And for those projects, I've got something to do tomorrow and the next day and the next day, right? So my level of worry starts off pretty low, and it stays pretty low for about the first half of the project. We call this first phase uninformed optimism. There's no conversations going on. There's no communication really happening other than, hey, we're setting up a meeting to talk about the project in the next few weeks. There's no plan. There's no plan to get a plan. And realistically, if there's no project plan and you have a 12-month project, how much work physically gets done in the first few weeks, the first 6 weeks, let's say, the first 8 weeks? Not very much. Maybe you set up a meeting. So now your 12-month project really only have about 10 months to execute it, which is clearly a challenge. So about halfway through the project, I start to get this bad feeling in the pit of my stomach that maybe things aren't going so well. And I've noticed that when I see my team members walking down the hallway, they're not talking about the project. They're not asking me about it. They're not talking about it. I got this bad feeling things aren't going so well. And then we move into the second phase of the project, which is called vague concern. The concern is vague. I can't confirm it because I don't have a plan to measure it against. But I got this really bad feeling that things are not going so well. And I think the funny part about this is what I'm really secretly hoping is I know I'm late, but I'm hoping you're more late than I am, because it's okay to be late as long as somebody else is more late. And so we move into this vague concern phase where I got just my spidey sense is tingling, telling me that things aren't going so well. Then we finally move into the third and final phase of the project, which everybody knows is called panic. And in the panic phase, only bad things happen, right? There's lots of conversations going on now, but it's all screaming and yelling, and usually interspersed with some curse words, right? It's not calm conversation. It's we're late. Everything is crazy. Everything is chaotic. I often joke that they should call project management the theory of chaos, because that's what it all really ends boiling down to. And in the panic phase, costs go up because you start throwing money at all your problems to get them to go away, and the quality really ends up suffering. Now, the way that I got started in all this was many years ago. I used to work for Coca-Cola, and we had a project called the Magic Can Project. It was early in my career. And the project went so badly that at the end of the project, the engineering manager got fired. He got let go. And that was an eye-opening experience for me. I said, man, I gotta get better doing project work, because I don't like the outcome of this. And so you can still Google this today. I'll give you the 5-minute thumbnail story. But basically, Magic Can was a promotion we ran back in, I think, 89 or 90, late 80s, early 90s. I can't remember now exactly when. And it was the way it worked was the can of Coke would have a prize in the top. So the money would pop out, or coupon for some free Coke would pop out, or whatever. And within engineering, of course, we wanted to make sure that you couldn't tell which one had the prize in it. So we actually filled 2/3 of the can up with carbonated water. So if you picked it up, it shook like a real Coke would. It felt like a real Coke would. But then we had the top 1/3 was the dry compartment. And it's typical with project work, right? So marketing came to us and said, hey, we want to run this promotion. And we said, no problem, we can do that. And then, of course, we had other things we were worried about and working on. So we put it on the shelf. And we finally dusted it off, went into the lab for testing. And what we found was there were certain situations where the glue would break down under extreme heat conditions, and liquid would leak into the upper portion of the can, which was not good. So the project ended up having to pull off the shelf. We had to bring it back to Atlanta. We had to redo the work. So my job for 3 weeks as a highly paid engineer was to drill holes in the bottom of these cans to drain the water. And then we had to put hot wax in them, seal them up, put them back in 12 packs, and ship them back out across the country so we could finish the promotion. So incredibly expensive financially, but also incredibly expensive emotionally, because at the end of that project, the leader was let go or forced to retire. So that's kind of what put me on the path of we got to get better at doing project work. And so I learned about this process, and this shift in the work curve really came home to roost for me. So all we're asking you to do now to be better at project work, to be better at working with your team members, to be better working with your teammates, to have the conversations that Pam was alluding to about not just yelling across the street, but maybe actually having a conversation and talking with people, is get together at the very beginning of the project and talk about it. For me, that ends up being a plan. We spend 2 or 3 days together and we build a plan that everybody agrees to and collaborates on. But have that conversation, build your plan together, understand the challenges you're going to have, understand where each person is coming from. And what we find happens is, for my level to worry about this project is now a little bit higher because I'm no longer uninformed. I'm now informed. I have a plan that says I've got to get this done by week 6, this by week 12, this by week 15. And my level of worry will increase when my task is due for this project, at which point it'll drop back down when I'm done with it until my next task comes due for this project. And I end up riding this wave of worry throughout the project. Now, I drew the orange curve finishing late because no planning process is 100% successful. But what we do know is by planning the project early, you'll be aware way back here early on that you're not on track to make it, and you can do things differently to be able to finish on time. But you'll be in control of the process rather than the process really controlling you. So the whole idea is shift the worry curve, have these conversations up front. And I know in dynamic worlds, we're all overburdened, all over allocated. There are more projects that we can ever get done. Global companies, I work with a lot of big companies, mid-sized companies, and almost all of them overlaunch more projects than could possibly be done. The deadlines seem to be super, super aggressive. So the tendency probably would be that I don't want to spend the time to upfront to have these conversations and plan the project out because I've got other things on my plate to do. But we know historically that if you do that, you plan them up front, your level of stress and worry go way down, and you end up with a higher quality product in the end. And really, it comes through having conversations. It's really what it's all about, is forcing ourselves to have these conversations. Kavita, I don't see the chat, so just jump in if there's any more questions, okay? Sorry.
Yeah, I'd say one of the questions we're curious about is what role does empathy play in effective communication, and how can individuals cultivate empathy in their communication style? And if you can build on just, you mentioned having communication early on. So, the empathy aspect of it would be helpful to understand.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I've had the good fortune of interviewing some pretty interesting people in my career. And I was talking to Dr. Sherry Turkle, who is a professor from MIT. She's written, I think, 6 or 7 books. One was a New York Times bestseller. I think that was called Reclaiming Conversation. And I was asking her specifically about empathy. And what she was saying was that the thing with empathy, you actually have to be in the moment. You actually have to look at people and say, I don't necessarily have to know how you feel, but I have to understand that the way you feel is meaningful to you and it matters. So I don't have to agree with your opinion, but I have to know it's valid to you and matters to you. So I can't just dismiss it. And it really means you have to stay in the conversation long enough so the person knows that you actually care about what they're saying. One of the challenges I see, especially with technology, is we're always multitasking. And I see people that they're in the room face to face, and yet the other person who's talking to them or listening to what they're saying is actually on their phone, busily typing away. And one of the I think incorrect things is today people believe truly that they are multitaskers. And yet research continues to show us over and over again that our brain is wired to be unitaskers. And if you may think you're great at multitasking, but you're not. You're better off, as humans, we're better at unitasking, getting something done and moving to the next thing. And when you multitask, there's a cost involved every time you shift gears and go to something else. And research has shown that it doesn't do as well. So if you are, and it's dismissive, if you think back to the empathy part, if I'm talking to you and you're distracted and doing something else, then that sends me a message that you don't really care about what I'm trying to say to you. I had a boss once that used to drive me insane. He would call me and say, I want you to come into the office. And I was about 45 minutes away. And I would drive all the way over there. And he would sit at his computer playing a game, Minesweeper, for those of you back in the day. And he would never look at me. He would look at his screen and play this game while he talked to me. And it just made me insane because it said that you don't value me so much that you're willing to split your time and play a game rather than spend all of your time focusing on me, that I just drove 45 minutes each way to get out here So I think empathy really plays a key role in having those conversations, but being in the moment, listening to what people are saying, focusing on what they're saying, and understanding, even if you don't agree with them, that's okay. Because I understand that what you're saying is valid to you, and I understand it means something.
Thank you, Clint. So we actually have another question to build on top of that, which is how do you actively engage people that early when the deadline is, far out in the horizon?
Another good question. So usually pain is a great motivator. Okay. One of the places I work is Caterpillar. And at Caterpillar, what would happen, and we would do new product development for them. And there would be a deadline that these are long projects. It'd be 2-3 year projects to develop a new tractor or a new bulldozer, let's say. And one of the things that comes kind of towards the end of the project is the supply chain piece, the procurement piece. And so we'd invite them to the planning session up front. And at first they wouldn't come because they said, well, we're 18 months later. We don't need to be there. But then what happens if you're not in the room? I have engineers making supply chain decisions. I've got engineers that say, I think they only need this amount of time for that. And they're missing some of the steps because they don't know supply chain steps intimately. And so then what happens is supply chain comes back later and says, wait a minute, you didn't give us enough time. Well, how about come to the meeting, spend a couple of hours with us, half a day with us, putting your task in the plan with the times that you need, the steps that you need, and let us know where we need to tie it into everybody else's work. And then you can go away for 12 months or 14 months until your tasks actually start. But come to the initial session to kick them off and plan your piece of it so that we do protect yours so it doesn't get compressed, because that's what's going to happen as an engineer. I'm going to say the best I ever saw it done was 3 weeks. Therefore, that becomes a standard. We know that's not realistic. So going back to the worry curve then real quick, one of the things I think is also interesting is people say, well, look how much smoother that green curve is. I like that project better. It's so smooth. Look how bumpy the orange curve is. That seems a lot worse. So the greenness, the smoothness of the green curve is not indicative of the fact there were no problems. I liken it to a bulldozer. You're just pushing all your problems into the future, which is why the back end and that gets so high. Another question that often will come up is, especially if there's engineers around, which is more worry? They'll ask is the integral of the green curve greater or lesser than the integral of the orange curve? And what they're really asking is, which is more worry? Now, sometimes if I'm drawing this by hand, sometimes the orange has more area under the curve, and sometimes the green does. Let me make the assertion for the moment that the orange is always more worry, even though I'm not drawing it that way today. But let me say the orange is always more worry. That's actually not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, which is more stressful worry? And the orange curve is just the everyday stress of doing your job, maybe staying late some nights, maybe working some weekends. The green worry, when you're in the panic phase, this is the gut wrenching, I hate my job. I can't sleep at night. I'm not sure I'm going to have a job or if I even want to have this job anymore. So it's a much more stressful kind of worry. I would much rather have the orange worry, which is just the more normal stress, than the stress of every day thinking I better polish up my resume because I don't really want to be here. Which is also interesting because we find that during the panic phase of projects, and the panic phase really in any situation, you tend to lose really talented people. Because if I think about, again, putting on my project blinders for a second, if I'm in the panic phase of the project, I'm probably working 60, 70, 80 hours a week on this project because I got to get it out the door. People are screaming at me. My life is miserable. But what happens to quality in the panic phase is quality suffers. So I'm starting to cut corners just to get it out the door. So now I'm thinking to myself, I'm killing myself working 80 hours a week and I can't even take pride in my work product. So I'm going to go find some place that doesn't do it this way. And so what we find is we lose really talented people during the panic phase of the project. Or what can also happen is bad reputations get attached to you through a panic phase of the project. If you're the last section in a project, if you're testing or you're integration or whatever that last phase is in your project, let's say I'm in testing and the engineers on the front end or the salespeople, whoever on the front end of the project take too long in the design, then I get it. It comes into me 6 weeks late. So I do Herculean efforts. I stay up, I work 60 hours a week. I just crazy weekends. I do a Herculean effort. I deliver the project 3 weeks late. Am I going to be applauded for having made up 3 weeks of lateness or only remembered for the fact that I was 3 weeks late? And unfortunately, history tells us it's the latter. So, we really want to shift the worry curve up front push it back up where it belongs, so that along the way in project work, there's always, every step of the way, there are steps that have to be done perfectly as planned or the project would be late. It's unfair to put all that pressure back on the back end where there's no room to maneuver. We also know from a cost perspective, it's better that way, because if you find a problem in the panic phase, the only way left to solve it is almost always the most expensive way. I saw a project once where they had to air freight concrete block to a construction site. Now, do you think the project manager of that project on day one ever believed he was going to be air freighting concrete block to a construction site? No, that's not the recommended shipping method. Put that stuff on a truck. You don't put it on a plane. But what happened was, it was for a hotel, and they wanted a special brick for the front of the hotel, and it wasn't ordered with the standard package. And by the time they realized it hadn't been ordered, the only way to get it there and be able to open the hotel on time was to air freight it, which is incredibly expensive. But the cost of air freighting was still less than the cost of missing the opening. What would have been better, of course, is to not miss the opening and to have the brick delivered the normal way. So it's incredibly expensive financially, incredibly expensive emotionally. We really want to avoid it. Could be any other questions before I keep going?
You can keep going.
Okay, perfect. So we talked about the cost issues, talked about the quality issues, and we talked about the worry. So I love this. It's an old data survey, but I really love this survey. Back in 1997, U.S. News and World Report did a survey, and they were asking people to answer the following question. I'm going to give you a list of people, and then I want you to tell me what percent chance do you think they have to getting into heaven or to a better place? And so these are the people they listed. So this is an old survey, but you probably recognize most of the people on this list. They actually did the survey right before Princess Diana passed away as well. And here are the percentages we got. So Bill Clinton got a 52% chance. Hillary got 55%, I guess 3% extra for putting up with Bill. Princess Diana was 60%. Michael Jordan, 65%, the highest so far, superstar. His colleague, Dennis Rodman, not so much, 28%. So if you followed basketball back in the day, you'd know why that was. Oprah Winfrey was the highest on the list at 66%. Then they asked the question, okay, what about Mother Teresa? What percentage do you give her? And when I first heard this story, I thought, all right, Mother Teresa, come on, it's got to be, I want to say 100%, but it's usually a tough crowd. So let me say 99, 98%. No, they gave Mother Teresa a 79% chance of getting into heaven. 79, so that's a tough crowd, right? There was one person, one group of people who actually scored higher. And who do you think that might be? That might be the people being surveyed at 87%. So they gave themselves a better chance getting to a better place than Mother Teresa. So the way I like to think about this is, so Mother Teresa and I get to the pearly gates together, and we're told there's only room for one of us. I look over at her and say, excuse me, ma'am, this spot's for me. So obviously, what is going on here? Why do we give ourselves a better chance of getting into a better place than Mother Teresa? And I think it comes down to perception. So in my world, if I'm working 60 hours a week and it's Friday afternoon and I owe Pam some information, and I've already put in 60 hours this week. It's 8:00 at night on Friday. I'm done. And I'm thinking, well, I'm just not going to get to this week. I'll have to get to it next week. But it's not my fault. My boss gave me too much work. I did my fair share plus some 60 hours. So I give myself credit because it's not my fault. Yet I hold other people accountable. So Pam owed me something and she didn't deliver it. All I know is she didn't deliver it. So therefore, my perception of what she did was worse. So when you're having these conversations, we're dealing with individuals, you're dealing with people, just understand there's a perception versus perspective, right? And so your perception is different than what the perspective may be. So understand who they are, where they're coming from, and they have the same 60-hour-a-week challenges you do. And people really, really matter. People matter. I think that's, if I have one overarching theme, people matter. Listen to what they have to say. And so one of the questions I often get is, what about technology? What role does technology play? So I love technology. I mean, I'm an electrical engineer. Of course, I love technology. And I think that technology enables us to do some really cool, great things, like have conversations on camera from across the world in a moment's notice. I think that's phenomenal. There are some things, though, that we lose when we rely too much on technology. And one of those is, I kind of alluded to it with the conversation before in the Minesweeper thing, but oftentimes I see people on Zoom in these meetings and they'll be asked a question. And I would say 9 times out of 10, there'll be a pause and they'll say, "Can you ask the question again?" And what that says is, I was on the call with air quotes, but I was really focused on something else, either doing emails or doing something else, something different. And so what ends up happening is you're not really focused on where you need to be. There was also a study done in one of the books that I was reading from Dr. Turkle. And there is a physical, you've ever heard the eyes are the windows to the soul? So I know I've heard that my whole life. And this study was showing that there's a physical connection that actually happens when you make eye contact. And what's interesting is when I was talking to Dr. Turkle, she said, "Clint, the funny thing is," she says, "I'm tricking you into thinking I'm making eye contact because I'm looking at the camera. So it looks like I'm looking at you." She says, "But you're way down here and I can't see you at all. So we're not really making that connection that we need to make." So I love technology. I think there are some things there's still some things that are always going to be better when we can be face to face.
Clinton, we'd like to ask, in your experience, are there industries or cultures or organizations where your project or your consulting project tends to notice most challenges in communication tend to be or observed?
So I don't want to broad brush it, but yeah, there are some places where I would say challenging is not accepted, right? Where it's very hierarchical, and once the person up above says A, then I do A. The challenge we have there, though, is you still have to do whatever mechanism you have to do, whether that's one-off conversations when the boss is not in the room. You have to get the information from them. And I remember being on projects in Japan, which is one of my favorite places to work. I love Japan. And challenges of understanding terminology or communication was also interesting, because I was having a conversation with someone and they were looking at me dead in the eye as I was talking, and they were nodding and they're going, "Hi, hi, hi." And so to me, I'm thinking, all right, they're getting everything I'm saying. They're agreeing with me. This is awesome. And then afterwards, somebody pulled me aside and said, "Hi does not mean I agree with you. It means I understand your speaking words. I understand you and I hear you, but it doesn't mean necessarily agree with you." So you have to make sure that when you do work in different cultures, different places, you pick up on those nuances, because they can be problematic if you don't.
That's interesting, because another question that we have is, what role does nonverbal communication play in conveying messages accurately, especially in this era of virtual communication?
Yeah, so I think there's a hierarchy here as well, right? So email is text-based. A lot of nuances get missed. You might misinterpret the email because you're having a bad day, or you might misconstrue a word to mean a certain thing when they didn't really mean it that way when they wrote it. So in that situation, I always try to, before I reply, I try to sit on my reply for a couple of hours or overnight to make sure that I read it the same way the next day when my mood might be different. And then we step up to having phone calls or Zoom calls where they're not on video. And it's really difficult because now I get the context of the voice and I can hear the tone, which is better. And I can ask, "Hey, when you said this word, what did you mean by that?" And oftentimes when I hear the person say the word, I can tell from their tone of voice what the meaning behind it is, whether it's negative or positive or just flat. And then we get into the Zoom call where there is some kind of physical connection where I can see you. But again, I'm only seeing your face. What I'm not seeing is whether you're taking notes, whether you're fidgeting, whether you're playing with your phone when you're looking down. So then you get into the face-to-face piece, which is always better because now I can see the full body, because I do think nonverbal cues play a huge role. Whether somebody is, if I'm just on Zoom and I just see your face, what I might not see is the fact that you're leaned back with your arms crossed, which is always an indication of maybe you're not agreeing with what I'm saying. Or if you just appear to be bored, I might want to find a way to bring you back into the conversation, because the reason you're in the room isn't just to have your name on the list, it's to actually engage with you, to have you give your opinion, because I value what you have to say. And so if you're bored and clearly not doing it, I want to try to bring you back into the conversation. And it's really difficult for me to do that if you're just on camera and I can't really see what you're doing other than just your face, or all I see really is your picture because you're not really on camera. And that makes it really challenging. So I think there's a hierarchy of the more you get up, the better, closer you get to face, And where I can see the body, the better it is for the nonverbal cues as well. Any others, Kavita?
We have one from Gary in the chat, in the question. Great presentation, he's saying. What he's thinking is that communication is a transactional focus and conversation is a transformational focus. And he's asking if he's off base.
Oh, I think that's awesome. That's fantastic. Yeah, I never heard that. That's a great way to put it. It is. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of conversation. I believe in it strongly. So I do find it to be transformational because it gets people on the same page. It brings us together. One of the things we do is we have these big, huge planning sessions where we fly people together from across the world and who only know each other through email. And what we find is that ability to bring them face to face over just a 2 or 3 day period, and before they go back to their respective places of residence, we're able to form bonds that we can now manage a project remotely for the rest of the next 18 months, or in my case for Olympics, 24 months, because we start planning those 2 years out, because of the connections we made. And we make those connections through conversation. Through a conversation, I learn who you are. You're not just an email address. You are somebody that has a kid like I have a kid, and your kid plays soccer, and my kid plays baseball, or whatever those things might be. And I'm really converting you from an email address into a human, living, breathing human being. So to me, that is transformational. 100%. That's a great point, Gary.
Clint, would you recommend some tools that organizations and leaders can apply to improve communication? Their assessment tools and things like that, whether that's global or hierarchical, whatever the reasons may be or the conditions may be. What are some tools that you recommend?
So off the top of my head, I don't know about any tools. I know, of course, there are many personality surveys people take, and it tells me whether this person is an introvert or an extrovert and how I should deal with them. So that might be a good place to start, just figuring out people within the organization, where they are. They're the kind of person that when things get stressful, they even tend to be more focused and more closed off, or whether when things get stressful, are they more creative and innovative? That's probably good information to have. But I think part of it just comes from not to beat a dead horse, but having a conversation with people, and through that, understanding where they're coming from and learning how to deal with each individual person in the way that works best for them. That same boss who played Minesweeper all the time drove me crazy. The one thing he did well was he would have a tendency to yell at people, but he never yelled at me because he knew that I would not take that well. I would not handle that kind of feedback, and yelling at me doesn't work for me. You want to give me feedback, then give it to me in a calm way and give me some suggestions how to get better. But if you're just going to scream and yell at me, then I'm just going to close my ears and wait you out. Right. So he did realize that about me. So I think part of that is just having that conversation. But there's some books I really like. I like John Katzenbach, who wrote, let's see, what was it? It's not, The Wisdom of Teams. He wrote The Wisdom of Teams, which is really, really great. It's all about how do you take individuals in an organization and form them into a cohesive team. And the quick Cliff's notes of that is really that you had to put a structure in place within which people begin to feel accountable to each other, and not just to the boss, but accountable to each other. And that's really how you take individuals and have them form a cohesive team. I like Sherry Turkle's books on reclaiming conversation, Alone Together, which is another great one on technology and how there's a place for it, but shouldn't replace conversation. She's fantastic. I also interviewed Allison Wood Brooks from Harvard once. She does a lot of research on conversation, and she has this great term I love called boomerasking. And so one of the things I hope I've gotten across today is that be in the moment and really try to understand where the person's coming from and really care about what they're saying to you. She says that in the research she finds a lot of people like to do what's called boomerasking, which means I'm going to ask you a question only so you hit it back to me so that I can tell you what I really want to talk about. So don't boomerask, be in the moment and actually care about what the person is saying to you.
Thank you, Clint. There's one other question we have from John Hargrove. How is the responsibility of clarifying the understanding of a message balanced between the speaker and the listener? does the speaker and do the speaker and the listener have equal responsibility, or is it more of the responsibility of the speaker or the other to verify understanding of the message?
It's another great question. I tend to be a 50-50 kind of person. So to me, of course, it's going to be more on me as a speaker because I want to make sure my message is received in the way in which I intended it to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, what do you have? What I usually try to do is have you tell me what you think I said back to me so that I can say, okay, that's not exactly what I wanted. What I really wanted was this. And what do you think about that? Is that going to work? So I'm going to try to create a dialogue where at the end of that, we are in agreement and aligned on the same thing and heading in the same direction. So I think it's on the listener to ask those questions and so I think that also as a listener, there's part of us are reserved because we've been the messenger that got shot. And if you shoot the messenger, then I'm not going to say anything anymore. So there's a tendency to say, I'm just going to listen. But I do think you have to ask those questions. You have to say, well, I don't understand that. Why are we doing that? And help me understand where we're headed with that. And when you say you want to do this, why is that the direction? How does that really work? So I think it's 50-50 as far as the listener have to ask the questions that they need answered to be able to truly understand the message. But at the end of the day, if I'm the person giving the message, it's my ultimate responsibility to make sure I've done it in a way that you understand. And I need to make sure that you received it in the way that I intended it.
We have one last question, but just wanted to see if you wanted to cover the next few slides before I went with that.
No, it's good.
Got it. Okay. So, you're the expert clearly in this. You're helping a lot of organizations. You've managed so many projects. Have you yourself experienced a almost failure situation as a result of poor communication? And how did you recover from it?
Well, I will tell you that having been married for a very long time, the first time I was exposed to this was when I first got married, and my wife was telling me a problem, and my immediate thought was I just need to jump in with the solution. And at which point I was clearly informed that's not my job. My job was to listen. So that was almost a failed project because I did not just listen. I do think there are oftentimes, and I see it all the time still, where a person will say something and think they've clearly communicated, and then the message was clearly not received because I watched the other person walk in a totally different direction. And so having been a part of the conversation, I was able to pull the other person back and say, well, hold on, I don't think we're all on the same page here, and bring us back together. So it can definitely get off the rails if you're not careful. So I think conversation is all about asking clarifying questions and making sure we're aligned and on the same page before we move on.
Thank you, Clint. I'm gonna give it over to my colleague Pam here.
So Clint, we are so grateful to you for being with us today. And I know you perhaps had a couple other slides to conclude. If you would like to take a minute to wrap up, any last parting words for our participants today, we'd love to give you that last word, and then I'll share what's coming up for Business Over Breakfast.
Well, let me end on a positive note with a cartoon. I love cartoons, clearly. That's why I use Acme Corporation as my foil in all my stories, because that's, if you're from a certain age, that's who the Wile E. Coyote bought all the stuff from to get the Roadrunner, which never worked. So one final slide on why I think conversation is important is in my project work. Traditional project management to me is the project manager is hidden behind the cone of uncertainty or the cone of silence. And through authority, fear, and intimidation, they're managing the project. And what they're really doing is yelling at the teams. This is your fault. You're not doing a good job. And the team doesn't know. They're just getting yelled at, right? So what we're trying to do is actually have a conversation, which is working together through teamwork, able to be successful in our projects and get successful projects done, and in a way that's not stressful, but instead is collaborative and working together and having those conversations. Because everything we do is conversations around defining the scope of the project and making sure we're aligned, conversations to build a plan, understand how we're integrated, and finally conversations to keeping the plan up to date. It's all through conversations.
Great. Well, Clint, thank you so much. I know that when you and I had the opportunity to chat prior to today's session, I was just so mowed over by the scope of the many projects that you have been involved in, but you always brought it back to the people. and about those conversations and about the communication. So we appreciate you being with us today and look forward to more. So if you will stop your share, I will share with our folks what is coming next for Business Over Breakfast. Let me get that pulled up real quick. Just a note for everyone, we are taking the holiday off. So our next Business Over Breakfast regularly scheduled would occur on July 4th. So we hope you have a wonderful and safe holiday and that you will join us again on July the 18th. We are excited to welcome Donna Peters back to the microphone, as we like to say, to talk about your personal board of directors, why you need one, and how you might go about building one. And then coming up with our short courses, I'd love to highlight a couple of things. As I mentioned at the front end of the webinar, I would save this till the end. Our application window is open for Goizueta's Executive Women's Leadership Program. This program really helps participants articulate a clear strategic direction, gain insight into their greatest ability to influence that will help navigate inside the corporate landscape, and then communicate with a compelling narrative. We'll also spend some time focused on the importance of and how to build strategic, meaningful relationships. Also open for application now are our MBA level credit-bearing courses. If you're curious about getting an MBA and want to kind of dip your toe in the water, or if you have already got your MBA and perhaps didn't have the opportunity to explore some of these topics, or simply want to kind of sharpen the tools that are already in your toolkit, we have several courses that are coming up this fall. Some of them are in person, some of them are online. You can check them out on our website, as my colleague Tammy's posting in the chat. There's applied entrepreneurship, data-driven market intelligence, product and brand management, and then strategy and organization in healthcare. We are appreciative again of you joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on July the 18th and hope that you and your family have a happy and safe holiday holiday celebration. And Clint, thanks again for joining us for this version of Business Over Breakfast. See you July the 18th.
Thank you.